This conference will now be recorded.
So last week we discussed about what is deployment and how to create a deployments and how to update the deployments in Kubernetes. So today we'll try to continue with other topics in Kubernetes, like values. So in Kubernetes, deployment is the recommended way to deploy the applications because it has some additional features, like we can update the deployment, we can roll back the deployment, and deployment has some deployment strategies while updating the deployment. So we discussed about what is all these things. Now we'll try to understand Kubernetes values. As you already know, right? Kubernetes is managing the containers. So when container is terminated and restarted, whatever data, whatever files we have in the container, we are going to lose the data. So here also we can use values. So values are nothing but a storage, a directory that's get mounted to a pod. Values in Kubernetes are very easy to manage. It's basically a directory that get mounted to a pod. We are going to mount values to the pod, then we will tell the container to use that value for storing the information. We will mount the values to the pod and we will tell the containers to use that value to store that information basically. So you can safely modify pods without losing your data. If we are using values, we can update the pods, we can recreate the pods without losing our data. Okay. Kubernetes supports many types of values. Kubernetes supports many types of values. A pod can also use n number of values simultaneously if required. Kubernetes supports many type of values. A pod can use any number of them simultaneously. So for consistent storage that is independent of the container, right? Whether your container is deleted or recreated, you need to have the state, you need to have the data. So we can use values. As I told, values are very, very important for stateful applications. Values are very, very important for stateful applications such as databases and other cache servers or any application that maintains the data that have a state. Values are very important for stateful applications. So to use a value in our pod manifest, to use a value, we will use these attributes. Right? A pod specify what value to provide for the pod, something like this, and where to mount these values to the container. In a container section, we will use this field. So Kubernetes supports several values. As we already know what is values, Kubernetes supports several values. It supports mtdir, it supports host path, it supports all these things like AWS, Elastic Block Store, EBS in case of AWS. Azure file or Azure disk in case of Azure cloud, Google persistent disk in case of GCP, NFS, and also config map as a value we can use. So it supports all these kind of values. So Kubernetes supports lot of values. Whatever you want to use, you can use for mounting your pod containers with that storage. Values are very, very important. Values are very, very important when it comes to stateful applications. So config map, and what is config map, what is secret, we will discuss in some time later, but we can mount this one also as a value. Config map can be created not only key value pair, you can create a config map with files. We can create a config map with file content, and you can map that config map with your container. So this I will explain when we go for a separate topic, what is config map, what is secret. And again, these config map and secrets also can be used as a values for your containers. So this one, Kubernetes supports many values. Now let's take one application. Let's take this application, Spring Boot and Mongo application. I want to deploy this application. I want to basically deploy this application. I have images. I want to deploy this application. Now to deploy this application, these images, what needs to be created in Kubernetes? How can I deploy these images? What needs to be created in Kubernetes? What and all Kubernetes objects? Can I directly create a pod? Is it recommended to create a pod? No. So in that case, how can I deploy these images? I can deploy as a replication controller or replica set or deployment. Which is recommended out of these things? I can deploy as a replication controller. I can deploy as a replica set, or I can deploy as a deployment, right? So which is recommended? Deployment is recommended. But for stateful applications in Kubernetes, there is one more application, one more object. For stateful application in Kubernetes, there is one more object which is recommended. There is a one more object called stateful set. So I will explain what is stateful set, why it is recommended for stateful applications like databases. Once we are clear about values, once we know what is volume, how to use values, then I will explain stateful set. So for databases, any stateful application like database or Jenkins or any cache containers like Redis cache, any stateful application, Kubernetes, what is the recommended object? Recommended object for a stateful application. Stateful set. When it comes to stateless application, like a normal application where we are not storing any data, any state, we are not maintaining any state. For stateless application, what is the recommended way to deploy? Deployment, not RC, not RS. Okay? deployment is the recommended way for a stateless application. For stateful application, stateful set. So I will explain this later. For now, Mongo is a stateful application. I am going to deploy as a maybe RS or RC, whatever it is for now, or maybe deployment. For now, I am going to deploy as a deployment or RS or RC for a Mongo database. But it is recommended to deploy as a stateful set. We will discuss later. This one I will deploy as a deployment. So can I create a single deployment with two containers in that pod? Is it recommended to run this container and Mongo container also in the same pod, or is it recommended to have two separate controllers? Two separate pods. So which means two separate controllers. Okay. And also, is deployment is sufficient, or do I need to create other objects also along with the deployment? We need to create a service. Why service? Why we need to create a service? To communicate. Service is for communication. So now let me deploy. Let me create a manifest file. So you know how to create a deployment, right? So I'll create something like this: API version app/v1 kind deployment metadata name spec selector. I'm giving a labels. Then template. What is this template? Pod template. Labels. Your pod labels. Then your pod specification. Containers. Containers. Name of the container. Image. From which image? Ports. Your container port. And if you remember, is it expected to pass some environment variables, this application, this image? If you remember, right? Like this application is going to talk to the database. This application is going to talk to the database. So the database username, passwords, they are expecting as a environment variables, right? So how can I pass environment variables? So in manifest file, in our manifest file, how can we pass that environment variables? Using env, environment, env. So we can pass environment variables using env, something like this. Env name, your environment variable name. What was the name? I think it was expecting some environment variables. The code is referring some environment variables, MongoDB host name. Now here I can give some name. So with this name, what needs to be created now? Because this application will talk to the database. Now database also running as a pod. To access the pod, what we are going to create? Service. So now this application, I'm giving Mongo here. So if I create a Mongo service with name Mongo for a database pod, now will this application will be able to access using service name? Yes. If I create a Mongo service with this name, in that case, I need to give that name, whatever name you are trying to create. Now, let's say again one more environment variable, username, value, devdb. Let's use something like this. One more environment variable, value, MongoDB password, value. Where is the typo? Volume. Where I'm using volume? So far I'm not using volume. I'm using value. Environment env name. So devdb @123. So this is how I'm using. I am passing as a environment variables. But again, is it recommended to pass values? Is it recommended to have values directly here? We'll slowly understand that one. Because in real time, will this value will keep on changing for every environment? This value will keep on going to change for every environment, right? And also, this YML files we will maintain in the version control system. This YML files we will maintain in the source code. Is it recommended? Is it best practice to have a confidential informations in version control systems? A big no. In that case, you still want to refer environment variable, but you don't want to reveal in your manifest. You still want to use environment variable, but you don't want to reveal in your manifest. That is where we have a config map and secrets. That is where you have a config map and secret. So you create a config map. You create a config map. Config map with key and value. Key and value. So this config map, you create a whatever config map with key and value. That config map you can refer here. That config map you can refer here. Instead of hard coding the value, I can say value from, right? I can say value from where you want to get this value. Config map key reference. You can say config map name and a key name, something like this. You are not going to hard code. So you are creating a config map, one more object. One more object. From that config map, you are going to refer that key. Config map name and the key in that config map I have defined as a key as the DB username. So you are creating a config map in the Kubernetes, one more object directly that you are referring. So here something like this. Suppose I created a config map in my Kubernetes cluster. This is my config map name. Within that config map, this is the key where I have defined the value. In that case, can anyone will come to know what is the username if you directly maintain this one in the version control system? No. And also for a different environment in each cluster, in dev cluster, I will create a config map with a different value. Key is same, value is different. For production cluster, I will create a config map with same name, same key, but value is different. In that case, do I need to modify this manifest file for different environments? Can I use same manifest? So that is where config map and secret comes into picture. So you can pass it as a value directly if it is not confidential. If it is not confidential, you can directly pass it as a value. If it is not going to be changed for environment to environment, you can directly pass it as a value. If it is a confidential and if it is going to be changed for environment to environment, this value, environment variables, then what concept we are going to use in real time? We are going to use config map and secret. This I will explain in separate session. Okay? But you already got an overview, but I will explain in a separate session. So we will discuss config maps and secrets when we go for that. Now understand only the values. Okay? So now I am passing environment variables. Now for this application, do I need to create a service? API version v1 kind service metadata, name of the service, spec type. This one I want to access outside also now, inside and outside both. In that case, what type of service needs to be created? Node port, port mapping, port default port, target port is 8080, and the selector app, Spring app, your labels, your pod labels as a selector. Now there is a database. Guys, when it comes to databases in real time, you have a lot of options to deploy database. If required, I can run database also as a container. In Kubernetes, I can run database also as a pod. Otherwise, can I use directly normal virtual machine I can create one virtual machine. Can I configure database in the virtual machine? Can I install the database in the virtual machine and use that for your application? Yes, I can use normal virtual machine also. I can install database in a normal servers instead of containers, and I can use that IP address of the server for communicating, for accessing the database, that database username, password, and IP address if it is a server. Or if I am running, I am having my infrastructure in the cloud, can I use managed database services? Like in case of AWS, there is a service called RDS. In case of AWS, there is a service called RDS in AWS, Relational Database as a Service. It's a managed databases. Who is going to manage database? Database, high availability and data backups of the database. If I go for RDS, high availability of your database, the data backups of your database will be completely managed by AWS. So I can create a RDS service, right? Instead of pod, in real time there are a lot of options, not only pod, right? You see, if I'm using AWS managed databases as a services, there are a lot of options. But if required, can I run my database also as a Kubernetes pod? Yes. But will most of the people run your database as a pod if they are using cloud, right? They are not going to use, but they are going to manage the databases using managed databases. Now I can create a database using RDS, right? You see, Amazon, Aurora, MySQL, MariaDB, PostgreSQL, right? Oracle, MySQL Server. There are a lot of services, databases. You create this database as a service. You can use this RDS endpoint and username and password to connect. So the architects will decide whether they want to use cloud managed databases, or they want to run database in a normal virtual machines, or they want to run database also as a pods or containers if they are using containers, right? Based on that we will use. But for now I am going to run database also as a container, right? So again, I am creating database as a deployment now, or replica set. But what is the recommended way if you want to deploy your stateful applications like a databases? For now I am creating as a deployment, but it is recommended to have a stateful set. We will discuss that later in the next sessions, right? We will understand what is stateful set, how it works. For now I am creating as a replica set or deployment, whatever it is. Now I am creating as a deployment. Now metadata, name MongoDB, whatever name, spec. So database, just one replica. You are going to give only one replica, right? So I'm not giving replicas also. Even though you give replicas, it will be like one. So now selector, match labels. I'm giving something like this, Mongo. Then template. What is this template? Your pod template. Name. Labels. Your pod labels. Your pod specification. Name. MongoDB container. Image. Mongo image. Ports. What is the Mongo database port? Container port. And which port database Mongo database will be running? Sometimes in the interviews they'll ask, right? 27017. And also environment variables. Because do we need to set up username and password for database? To secure my database, we need to set up a username and password. When it comes to this image, how they are expecting to pass username and password, which you want to set, how they are expecting to pass, right? So this one needs to be passed as an environment variable. How to know the default ports, right? How do you know Tomcat port? By understanding, by reading Tomcat, what is Tomcat? How do you know Jenkins, right? What is the port? By understanding, by reading Jenkins, right? Similarly, you need to understand what is MongoDB, what is the requirement for minimum MongoDB, right? You need to understand by reading the documents, right? When I come to here Mongo, there is a image. There is a image. Now here they are explaining what is Mongo, what is MongoDB, right? And how to use this image. And you see MongoDB in the image, which will listen on the standard MongoDB port 27017. And how they are expected to pass the username and password, right? If you see, when you start MongoDB image, you can adjust the initialization of Mongo database instance by passing environment variables. We can set the username using this environment variable. So username devdb, I am passing password devdb @123, something like this. So now my database is protected, initialized with these credentials. But if my application use different username and password, will it connect? Suppose if I use something like this, will it work? Will application will be able to talk to database if I give a wrong password? Will application will talk to database if I give a wrong password? Database is initialized or database is configured with a different password. And if I use different password here, it will not work. Make sure you give correct. And again, since I am using YML, can I use hash here, guys? If I use hash, what does it mean in the YML? Comment, right? Comment. Don't use hash for now. Then service. It will not sync. Rubana Kumar is asking, if we created two MongoDB parts by mentioning same value, then will it data sync? Guys, when it comes to databases also, there is a concept called clustering. There is a concept called clustering, database cluster. If I just create two pods and if I use same value, your database will not start. If I use two pods, if I create two pods, if I use same value, your database pods will not start. Because in case of database, you need to have a clustering. What is the meaning of clustering? The way you have a masters and workers, right? Similarly, database also, there will be a primary database, there will be a secondary databases. If you just create two replicas using same value, it is not going to work. So it has altogether different concept. So you need to have, each pod should have its own value. Each database pod should have its own value, and you need to set up clustering. You need to do some settings in the database pods. You need to initialize primary database. You need to add other pods, other containers or other servers as a secondary databases. So in database also you have a clustering, primary and secondary. Primary will be used for write operations. Secondaries will be used for read operations. And once you set up primary and secondary databases, they all will be in sync. They all will be in sync because primary knows what are the secondary databases, right? So whenever any data is written to the primary database, the primary will flush the data to the secondary databases automatically. But for that one, you need to do a completely different setup. So it's not like if you just create two replicas and you use same value, it is not like you have a two databases, one primary, one secondary. If I give two parts here, if I give replicas as two, if I use same value, your parts will not come up. If I give just something like this, replicas as two, and if I use same value, your part will not come up because it should know which one is primary, which one is secondary. So it is altogether a different concept. Okay. Now let me create a service for this database. Kind service metadata. Anyone from database background here in the class? Anyone from database background here in this class? Database admins, any database. Okay, so no one is there, it seems. Now I'm creating a service for this database, right? Service name is Mongo. So with this name, application is talking. So what is the host name I have given for my application? This is my Java code. Java code is talking to the database. So instead of hard coding the IP address of the containers or the pods, we are using name. This name is what? Whatever name I am passing here, that name is basically the service name of your database. So again, this database, I want to access only within the cluster. I don't want to access outside. In that case, what type of service? Databases don't want to expose outside. I want to access within the cluster. In that case, cluster IP. Then ports. The port. Here, since it's a database, not a web application, I am using port also same as your target port. So it's a database, right? It is not a front-end application. It is not HTTP port. It is TCP port. So I'm using this port also same as target port, because in the application also it's hard coded, right? So service name is Mongo, and the service port. The port is also 27017. Most importantly, selector. Selector. Now, can I give something like this? Is it correct? Now, if I give something like this service will try to find a parts. The service will try to find a parts with whatever label has this one. But in that part, do I have a database containers running? No, right? So make sure you give a correct selector. Mongo. Now, with this, I can deploy the application. Siddharth was asking, can we create a cluster D pods? What is cluster D pods? I don't understand. What is the cluster D? Databases, cluster pods. You mean to say primary database, secondary database? Yes, that's where you can use. That's where you can use stateful set. You create a stateful set where you can do that kind of a clustering setup. So now let's deploy this application. Since I have not mentioned namespace, under which namespace this will be going to be deployed? The default. Guys, if you want to do the dry run, I mean to say if you want to validate this YML, whether this YML is proper or not, we can do the dry run also. Hyphen dry run equals to client. So it's a dry run to validate whether that YML is proper or not. Now I am doing a dry run. It is saying created, but is it actually created? No, it's just a dry run. Now, if I do the dry run, I will come to know whether YML is proper or not. Now, do you see all these objects will be created if I actually do the run? Do I have any YML syntax issues, indentation issues now? No. So you can do the dry run if you want to do the dry run. Now I'll execute actual. But before that, let's see how many applications I have. Because if I keep deploying applications, it may not work. That's fine. Now let me apply. Now do you see, is the containers are getting created for front-end application? There is a deployment for front-end application. Do you see parts are getting created for that? And also for database also I created as a deployment. The deployment is created a replica set. That replica set is managing the pod. Now my application is getting deployed. Now all are up and running. Now, do you see a service created also for the front end and the database also? Now, for outside, I want to access. From outside, I want to access this application. I can use node IP and node port. So let me go. Sorry. Let me open that port, any port. I mean to say any node. That no need to be a master node. In any node, from any node you can access using node IP and the node port. This is the port. Now that node IP address, this is running on a root context, right? I am getting a home page. Now whatever data I am persisting here, the front end is going to talk to which one? The developer has written the code, right? Developer has written the code. So the request goes to this application. This application has a code. Developer has written a code which will connect to the database and it will insert the data. So what database developer is using? Developer is using Mongo database. So how application will talk to the database? By using database details, database URL, username and password. So developer is also not hard coding that username, password, and where exactly database is running. Because for environment, the IP addresses will change, usernames will change. And again, if you are running as a container, your container IPs are dynamic. So that's why he is not hard coding. So when we are deploying this application, we passed as a environment variables. Right? Now it will talk to the database and maintain the data. You see. Now where exactly the data, whatever I am processing, that is sitting now? Where exactly we have a data now? The front end is talking to the database. In this database part, we have the data. In this database part, so this is my database pod container file system. Now within this, we have a data folder and DB folder. This is where it is writing the data. In this pod, we have a container, only one container. This is the container directory where it is writing the data. Now we are not using volumes. For some reason, your pod is gone. For some reason, your pod is deleted. Pod can go down for any reason. I'm intentionally deleting the pod. I'm intentionally deleting the pod. Now pod is deleted, but since we have a controller, will the pod will be automatically recreated? Will the pod will be automatically recreated? You see pod is again recreated. I got a pod again. But will I have this data? Whatever data was persisted earlier. You see why I am not able to see the data? Because the file system, the container is deleted and container is recreated. So whatever data you have in the container is lost. It is not recommended, right? It is not recommended. So that is where volumes comes into picture. In Kubernetes also you have a volumes. It has a different types of volumes, right? Kubernetes volumes. We have a volume called mtdir. We have a volume called mtdir. It's kind of a temporary. We are not going to use this one, right? But in the interview they'll ask, guys, sometimes in the interview they'll ask, what is mtdir volume in Kubernetes? Sometimes in the interview they'll ask, right? Kubernetes has a lot of volumes. Kubernetes volumes. As we discussed, We already, the files in the container, the files in the containers are ephemeral, which means once the container is deleted, your files is also gets deleted, your container files. So we are going to use the values. Kubernetes supports lot of values. Like in case of AWS, we can use EBS value, right? We can use Azure volume, Azure disk, basically Azure disk, and Azure file in case of Azure cloud. Like this, we have a lot of values. Config maps also we can use as a value. Now we have one volume type called mtdir. It is not, we are not going to use, but sometimes in the interview they will ask. Mtdir volume is like a temporary value. Mtdir volume will be created when the pod is assigned to a node, and it will exist as long as that pod is running on that node. So it is kind of a temporary, that mtdir value will exist as long as your pod exists. If your pod is deleted, that mtdir value also will deleted. But if your container is crashed and if container is recreated, you still have a data. But if the pod itself is deleted and recreated, you will not have a data in mtdir. It is kind of a temporary storage, temporary value. So which we are not going to use. And if you see, there is a one more value called host path. Host path value. What is meaning of host path here? What is the meaning of host and host path? What is the meaning of host path value? What is host or node? The server. So server file system. In case of Docker, it is like in Docker you have a local values, right? Local values. So host path, server path, right? So if you see here, host path value. Host path value is basically, it will mount a file or directory from the host file system. What is the meaning of host here? Your node. In whatever node your pod is getting created, whatever node your pod is getting created, from that node, from that server file system, you can mount a folder or a file to your pod. So we can create a host path value for your content, your pods you can mount. So how to mount values here? If you see, for our pod, as I told, we are going to define values for your pod. Under your pod specification, you are going to define a value, like what is the value name and what type of value. Then I'm just attaching a value to my pod, but do I need to use this value with my containers, whatever containers I want to use? With this, we are just defining a value. What type of value I want to use? We are attaching a values to the pod. But do I need to use this value with my containers? Whatever container. So how we are defining that? How we are mounting for your container? For your container, what we are using? We are using one more thing called mounts, value mounts. Here you are attaching a values to the pod. That volume you are mounting with your container using volume mounts. So as we already discussed, can containers in a same pod can share the value? What is common for the containers which are running in a same pod? If I have two containers, can I share that value? I mean to say, other container also will it able to mount the same value if I have a two containers? Yes. Yes, that's what the meaning of sharing, right? Within that pod, value, the storage is common, the network is also common. If required, you can mount this value with other container which is running in a same pod. Using value mounts again, you can mount the same value for the same pod, same container. If you remember, what is common for your pods when we discussed about pod? Storage and network. Now, if I have two containers, if required, can I mount this value, both the containers? If required, it is not mandatory, if required. As I told, this container can read something and write it to this value. This container can again process that storage, that data. Right? If required, we can mount. Now I want to use a values for this application. Now can I use host path volume for now? How can I use volumes now for my database? And again, is it required? Volumes is required for this application, guys. If my front end application is deleted and recreated, do we have any issue? Do we have any data loss? This one, no. So I don't need a value for this pod, this container. But for this one, the database, do I need to define a values? So now, how can I define the values? There are two things. Under your pod spec, you can define a values. Guys, again, is this order matters or indentation matters? If you see here, under your pod specification, they have defined values later, containers first. But instead of that, can I define values first, containers next? Is the order matters? Order doesn't matter. The indentation matters. So under your pod spec, under your pod template, or under your pod specification, we have a values, we have a containers. So here I can define values here, or I can define values here also. But can I define here values? Is the indentation correct? Can I define here? You see, can I define here? Here or here? No. So it should be sibling of your containers. It should be sibling of your containers, values. Now, name of the value, something like this. Whatever name you want to give, you give name. So let's say let me give name as host path val, something like this. Now, what type of value? Kubernetes supports different types of values, right? Host path, NFS, different values. So here what I can do, whatever value, host path value. So within this one, within under this host path, again I have a one more attribute called a file, sorry, directory path. This path. So what is this path? Whatever path I give here, What path is this? Whatever I give, something like this, or I can give. So do I need to create this folder, or automatically Kubernetes will create this folder in the server if this doesn't exist? Do I need to create that folder in the server because it's a server path? Suppose if this folder doesn't exist, does Kubernetes will create this folder, then it will mount, or do we need to create a folder upfront? So it will be created by Kubernetes if this doesn't exist. So this is my server directory, values. I just defined a values, but do I need to mention that values here? Do I need to use that value with this container, my database container? So how can I use that value here? For the container level, for this container level, what do we have? Value mounts, value mounts for this container. So this is one container, right? For this container, value mounts. So now here again, name, and it will have a mount path. It will have a mount path. So what is my mount path here now? What is my mount path here now? Which directory you want to mount for this container? What is my mount path? Where exactly Mongo database is maintaining the data? Data slash db slash data slash db. Now, how can I link this value with this mount? What should be common? The name. The name. So whatever name you have given for a value, whatever name you have given for a value, that you are giving as a value mount name. So now this container directory is going to use what type of value? This container directory will be mounted with what type of value? This container directory is going to use host path value, and this is the path. So how we are linking, I mean to say how we are mapping the value with mounts. What is common here? Whatever name I have given a value, that is your value mount name, right? So since it's an array, can I use multiple values for my pods? Can I also mount multiple values? Yes. If you have a multiple values, right, you can mount. Now I am using values. Let me deploy. Guys, since I am using deployment for database pod also, when I apply this one, will it be recreated? Will the pods will be recreated? Since I am using deployment for database, instead of deployment, suppose if I would have used a replica set, replication controller, in that case, do I need to delete and recreate to reflect these changes? Yes, you need to delete and recreate to reflect these changes. Since I am using deployment, it will be recreated with these changes. Now, before deleting, let me show you. Before applying this change, kubectl get pods, kubectl describe pod, your database pod. Now, if you see, it is not using any value. It is not using any value and value mounts. But by default, every pod will have one value. By default, every pod will have one value. It will get mounted with service account. Every pod will have one value by default. It will be mounted with this path, service account path. That will be by default. Now, do you see any other value like the data slash db? Is it mounted with any value here? No. Now, let me apply this change. there is some, okay, the volume names, right? We should follow some standards, right? We should not use uppercase characters here. The volume name, right? V. V should be small and also. So let me apply. Now, if you see, is my database part got recreated? Now, do you see? Is it getting recreated with that changes? Because I was updated the values. I updated the values, right? So now it is coming up. Why it is in pending state? So it's assigned to this node 85. Yeah. So it is assigned to that node. Later it has pulled the image. Now it is going to create a container. It is assigned to that node, right? It is going to pull the image. Now container is in this state, container creating. Why? It is taking some time. Let's wait for some time. It is under container creating state. Maybe let's do one thing, guys. Let's delete because we don't have enough resources, right? Let me delete other things. Let me delete this one, kubectl, delete deployment. I'm going to delete this deployment because we don't have enough resources. Similarly, let me delete this Mongo also. I'll recreate. If you see, since I'm using deployment, is it terminating the old one unless until the new one comes up? And the deployment strategy. What is the default deployment strategy? Rolling update, right? So that's why, do you see, is it terminating the old part unless until this new part comes up? No. Why it is not coming up? Because I may not, I may don't have enough resources. You see, already one server went down. It is showing not ready. Why it is showing not ready? Because it doesn't have enough CPU and memory. We deployed a lot of applications and the kubelet process might have went down. Let me describe the node. If you see, node status unknown, memory pressure, node status unknown, memory pressure, right? So there is a memory pressure. Why there is a memory pressure? Because we deployed lot of applications and this capacity is very slow. This capacity is very low. The server capacities are very low. How much we have? Just 1 GB and 1 core, right? So that's why it's already impacted. One node is not ready and I deployed lot of applications and that's why it is not able to come up, right? So let's do one thing. Let me delete everything. Now how can I fix that node issue? That node went down, right? I mean to say it is showing as not ready. One of the node is showing as not ready. Why it is showing as not ready? Because the kubelet process might be down. That kubelet process might be down. With whom it is going to interact in the node, in the worker, to manage that node? The control plane will interact with whom? The kubelet. The kubelet stopped responding, right? So this node 85, right, which is this one, this node 85. Let me see if I can SSH. If I can SSH, what I can do, if I can SSH, I can restart, I can start the service. Second. Let me create one more. Let me go to one more tab. Let me SSH to that machine. That let me SSH to this machine, worker machine. I am not able to SSH also because it's start responding. What is the only option I have now? I am not able to SSH also to that machine which is not responding, right? What is the only option now I have? That node, this node which is not ready, I am not able to SSH also. Then the only option is restart. I need to reboot that server. I'm stopping that instance and I am starting. I mean to say I am rebooting. I'll reboot that. I can increase the instance type, but if I don't want to increase, I will just stop the server and I'll start the server. Because I have already deleted all the applications, right? When I start it back, it is not going to deploy anything unless until I deploy. Because in my cluster, did I deleted all the pods? I executed kubectl delete all. If you want to change the instance type, you can change. Otherwise, I'll stop the server and I'll start the server. If the kubelet come up part on, if the kubelet service comes up, will it report to your master instead of not ready state? If the kubelet works properly, can I see the status as ready? Yes. Right. Let's see that. I'm stopping the server first. So that's why I say, whenever you are practicing with very less capacity servers, don't create multiple pods, multiple applications, right? Delete and apply only few pods. Otherwise, you have a very high capacity. Maybe instead of T2.micro, you can go with the T2.medium or T2.large. taking time. Now let me start it back. Volume is for pod, right? Here also I am using this volume, right? That host path volume, that is for that pod. Because where are you mentioning your volumes? So you are in your pod specification, you are mentioning the volumes, right? So this volume is for this pod. Now let's up and running, right? Now let me see if I can connect to that server. Now I connected to this server. Make sure you have a kubelet service running. Kube sudo service kubelet status. It's active because we have enabled the kubelet on bootstrap. So the kubelet service started automatically without any issues. Now here, can I see that node in ready state? Since the kubelet has running successfully in that node, right? It is in ready state. Now I will deploy. I deleted most of the pods, right? It is getting terminated because these pods were running in that node. These pods were running in that node initially. In that 85 node, these pods were running initially. Since that node went down, it was not able to delete. So I executed kubectl delete all. But since that node went down, it was not able to delete. Now this node is up. Once this node is back, it has successfully terminated. Now we don't have anything in this namespace. Now let me apply that YML. Since I deleted service also, again I recreated a service, port got changed. Since I deleted a service and again service got recreated, port got changed. Let me use that port. Service port. So let me open that port in the security group. Now you see, this time my database pod is still, it is coming up. Why? Yeah, it is running. Now this time, do I have my database pod with volume? If I describe the pod also, I can see that information. Now do we see volumes here? What type of volume we are using? Volume name is this. What type of volume we are using is host path. What is the path on the host? Temp slash Mongo. So this host path is mounted with which one? Mounts. You can see mounts here. That host path volume, this is the name of the volume, is mounted with which one? Data slash db. Now the database pod is scheduled on this node. The database pod is scheduled on this node 85. So in that server, /temp/mongo is mounted with that container. Now whatever data now the database is writing, where exactly it is going to maintain? Whatever files are getting generated in the data/db in the container directory, where exactly it is getting maintained? In the server /temp/mongo, in that server. Now if I delete my pod, if pod is deleted, since we are using value, right? If the pod gets created, if the pod gets recreated in the same node, in that case, will I have a data loss? No. But if you see, now pod gets recreated on same node or different node? On a different node. Now the data, whatever data we had earlier, is that in this server, or earlier the pod was running in this server? So is the data is there in this server? No. Since the pod is rescheduled to another node, we have a data but in the other node. But since the pod is scheduled into a different node again, will I see this data? Why I am not able to see this data? Because the pod got rescheduled to a different node. Since I was using host path value, the data is in the other node. Now if I use host path values, if the pods are getting rescheduled to a different nodes, do you see a data consistency? If I am using host path value, and if pods are getting recreated to a different nodes, do you see a data consistency? No, unless until you have some other process which will sync your servers outside of Kubernetes. Outside of Kubernetes, if you have some other process which will sync your data between the servers, you don't see a data consistency. Does anyone heard about rsync? Rsync, right? So that is one process to sync the data between the servers. If you have a rsync created, then it will sync your data between the servers. But if I don't have a rsync, if I am using host path values, if pods are getting rescheduled to a different nodes, do you see a data consistency? No. Instead of host path values, if I use external values like NFS, EBS, in that case, will the data will be maintained in the server file system or external file system? If I use different storages instead of host path. So instead of host path, I can use different values we have. I can use NFS, I can use EBS, right? Or if I am using Azure cloud, my Kubernetes cluster is in Azure cloud, I can use these storages. If my Kubernetes cluster in Google cloud, I can use this storage, right? Cloud storages. Suppose you are running your Kubernetes on an on-prem. In that case, can I use NFS storage? What is NFS? Network file system, right? You can have a NFS server and you can use that NFS server values in your containers. Okay, so that NFS value we will discuss tomorrow. What is NFS value, how to create NFS server, and how to use that one. Most importantly, in Kubernetes, there is a concept called PV, and PVC. Persistent value and persistent volume claim. So this is the recommended way to use the volumes, persistent volume and persistent volume claim. So whether you use host path, whether you use NFS, whether you use any storage, but what is the recommended way to use volumes with your pods? Using this concept PV and PVC, persistent volume claim. So tomorrow we will understand what is PV, what is PVC, right? Tomorrow we'll continue with volumes, guys. Any question before I start the session? Empty directory is a temporary directory, temporary storage, which we will not use. The temporary directory, right, will exist. That will exist as long as your pod exists. If your container is crashed, and if the container is recreated, you don't see a data loss if you are using empty dir. But if the pod itself is deleted and recreated, do we have a data if you are using empty dir? If the pod itself is deleted and recreated, no. It's a temporary storage, right? We don't have any use case. If you have a use case for a temporary storage, then you can use empty dir instead of host path or NFS, right? If you have any use case to just maintain the data as a temporary storage, which means if the container is deleted and recreated, still you have a data. If you use empty dir value, if the pod itself is deleted and recreated, you don't see a data. If you have that kind of use case, you can use. But I have not used empty dir anywhere so far. Whatever we discuss here, based on the use case we are going to use, guys. We are not going to use all the things and everything whatever we are discussing here. I am explaining a lot of things. Are we going to use everything in the real time? Whatever fits for your use case, whatever fits for your requirement, you are going to use. Now, I deleted again, which was scheduled to 171, and again it is moved back to 85. But this time, can I see those two records, whatever we had earlier? So do you have a consistency? If I use host path value, if the pods are getting scheduled to a different nodes? No. But can I make sure my pods will be scheduled in the same node by using some other concept? Now, if required, I want to schedule these pods into the same nodes using other concept, scheduling concept. Yes, you have a node selector, node affinity, so which will make sure the pods will be scheduled on the node, same node, whatever node you want to schedule. That is a scheduling concept which we will discuss later. Okay, that's it for today, guys. We'll continue tomorrow with this NFS value, and also we'll discuss about PV PVC. Very important. Thank you. I'm stopping the session for today. We'll continue tomorrow.